and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for Michael Willis' talk, Discover San Francisco, Inclusion by Design. I'm Shirley Juster, a 1969 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences and the past chair of the WashU San Francisco Bay Area Alumni Network. In that capacity, I had the pleasure of coordinating with Michael on his celebrated architectural walking tours over the past several decades. So you're in for a treat today. Before we begin, I'd like to explain our format for today's session, which will last approximately 1 hour. You will hear and see only me and our presenters, but we encourage you to participate by typing your questions at any time in the Q&A box. At the end of the presentation, we'll address as many of those questions as time permits. And a thank you to all of you who included your questions with your registration. This webinar is being recorded and will be accessible on the Alumni Association YouTube channel and on the website following the event. And now it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Michael Willis. Michael is a 3-time graduate of WashU, receiving his bachelor's degree in 1973 and both of his master's degrees, architecture and social work, in 1976. Michael founded MWA Architects, Inc. in 1988, where he served until retirement in 2016. MWA Architects has created master plans for mixed income, affordable housing projects in San Francisco, Oakland, Portland, and in post-Katrina New Orleans. Urban projects include the Fillmore Streetscape Project and the Blue Bridge. Michael was a principal architect on the International Terminal at San Francisco Airport. He was the prime architect for Terminal 2 at Oakland's International Airport. And he currently serves as the lead architect behind the Central Subway Station at Yerba Buena Moscone Center, a project now under construction. Michael has been the principal architect for many water infrastructure facilities, most recently the rebuild of San Francisco's Southeast wastewater treatment plant adjacent to an historic Black neighborhood. Since 2017, Michael has been a design consultant and has taught at Washington University, most recently in the spring 2020 semester. He is a distinguished Washington University alumnus for the university, the School of Architecture, and the Brown School of Social Work. He has been leading biennial architecture walks for WashU since 1987. Please join me in welcoming my dear friend, Michael.
Hello, Shirley, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It seems like you were talking about somebody else. It's very humbling to hear. But I would like to get on with it because we only have an hour, and although here in Corona times we can't meet in person, of course, so this walk will be the first one that we're doing virtually. So I'm going to give this walk some structure. As Shirley says, we've been doing this every other year since '89 with Shirley and myself since '87. But to give this walk some structure, I thought we should look at I would focus on 6 cool places that you should know in San Francisco. But first, a little introduction. The original title was Discover San Francisco Inclusion by Design with Michael Willis. I didn't want this to be a lecture, but I thought I would add a note about what design means to the newly evolving wake of inclusion. To me, this is simply allowing those who were previously kept out of the design world just because of their color inside the design world. One of the reasons that there are so few Black architects is that for most of the country's history, they were not allowed to go to schools of architecture, including Washington University, which when I went to school was the only architecture school in the state of Missouri. This is partially the reason why we have about 2.4% of all registered architects in the country as Black. And that includes the recently registered 400th Black woman as an architect. You can look it up. And when you do, you will see that this isn't an issue of talent or desire. It was at the time a willful act of exclusion. I think the country is a better place when it allows all voices to be heard. I hope you would agree. That's one of the reasons why I added one of my projects, the 1999 Hallidie Plaza Elevator, because of what a WashU journalist said about it at the time, about 21 years ago. There is always an expectation about a population and what those people may or may not, quote, deserve. What we do as architects is transform not only the clients and the public's ideas of what that population deserves, but that population's own expectations as well. In other words, let design be design and speak to all of our higher aspirations. With that, let's start the tour. I'm going to start with a word that I gave to the our last in-person tour called Traum. The dream of buildings and places you should know in San Francisco. Traum is the German word for dream, but I use the letters of that word to describe what would be a successful formula for urban design. T, transport, for transportation. R, Raum, for space. A, Arbeitsplatz, places for people to work. U, Überraschung, surprise, in color and in art. And M, Menschen, people, creating a place where people want to live, work, and play. I asked the tour to speak the word with me, Traum. It sounded like a dream then. But now I'm going to focus on this dream on 6 places in San Francisco, which I think you should visit when Corona lets you. And all of these have some connection with the dream of urban spaces and Traum, and you can figure out what they are. But the 6 places are the Blue Bridge in the Fillmore, street widening, art, and neighborhood development in a major location of the Black population in San Francisco at Fillmore and Geary. And this is the U, a surprising place for art combined with a typical street widening project. 125 Mason, on the edge of the bustle of downtown San Francisco, plus the reality of the Tenderloin. The Hallidie Plaza Elevator. This is part of the T for transportation, or in reality, it connects people from Market Street to the BART station, and it is the R, the space. It is an urban marker, and it anchors a below grade space next to the cable car turnaround at Market Street. The Yerba Buena Moscone Center subway station, one of the new central subway lines designed by my firm, now under construction. And in the spirit of design by inclusion, I'm trying to give a sense of what all of this meant to me when I was in practice. But so those projects I mentioned before by MWA, but the following 2 are not. The Hallidie Building, an amazing structure by Willis Polk at 130 Sutter at Montgomery, built in another surprising time, the 1917-18 so-called Spanish flu pandemic. And finally, Salesforce Park, a 3-block-long urban park by Pelly Clark Pelly, landscape architecture by Alan Greenspan, brimming with flora, views, and contemplative space above the new Trans Bay terminal that connects Oakland across the bay to San Francisco, starting at Beale and Mission Street. So let's begin. The Blue Bridge at Fillmore. When MWA Architects got the assignment to design the Fillmore streetscape project, it came in 3 parts. One was to widen Fillmore at Geary, so it would, one, accommodate both pedestrian traffic and the bus stop. Two, design a plaza for a beloved leader of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, Gene Tuttle Plaza. And three, the bridge over Geary, which became the site of the Blue Bridge. So first, it was a practical project to widen Fillmore Street to make room for moving pedestrians and people waiting for the bus on both sides of the street. Next slide, please. Next slide. So there it is. So it was also the site of an installation project in blue tinted glass by the renowned Black architect Mildred Howard, which graces a poem inscribed in glass, in the panels of glass, by another St. Louis and Quincy troupe, entitled "Shades of Blue for a Blue Bridge" for Mildred Howard, Joe Rudolph, and Yori Wada, which outlines the Black history, the places of music and food, and the Japanese influence which came into being due to the urban renewal. There's that term again. Let's see, urban renewal, which are the policies of San Francisco planning director Justin Herman, creator of Western Addition, as it became known. The bridge structurally is just fine, but the art installation, beautiful at first, is now in terrible repair. Here is the poem you can no longer read due to the broken glass. Three shades of blue. Three shades of blue evoke Minnie's Can Do, Sue Chow's Yori Wada, Jimbo's Bop City, John Lee's Boom Boom Room, history riffing blue matzo balls, fried chicken, soba, the Jigoku Club inside J-Town, bold rebels jamming across from Blacktown, udon, grits, barbecue, cherry blossoms blooming in Lady Day's hair, greens and fatback, sashimi staining kimonos, you walking Fillmore, crossing Geary with the Duke, streetcars running over ghost tracks, pig feet and vinegar, indigo blue, and white red satin, sticky fingers handling chopsticks, hot cornbread, sweet potato pie. If you don't remember, if you didn't recognize the music, it was Oliver Nelson, another St. Louisan, with his Stolen Moments. I would love to find a sponsor to renew the bridge. The door is open. So where are we right now? Yes, there is a shift in population demographics. There was always the divide of Geary, separating the Black population from the more economically advantaged population north of Geary, home of the concerning issue of gentrification as you walk up Fillmore. But now the blue glass on the bridge is broken. The benches at the bus stop are removed. The concrete has been painted over and the plaques are defaced. And yet, further up the street, snappy shops, restaurants, coffee, furniture, all the way up to Pacific Heights. But what about the jazzy, cool, neglected Fillmore? How can we restore that former beautiful arc of food, music, history, and Black culture? I don't have the answer, but I do have the message. It has to be done now, sooner than now. So the arc of beauty has to go further than something just done in the 90s to appease a community. The arc of beauty has to be restored now. Sometimes I remember that the larger community may have thought, fine, we've done something for that Fillmore community, that's it. And those places are in a kind of disrepair which would not be acceptable up the street, say at Fillmore and Jackson. So no, more has to be done. The arc of urban beauty must be returned to the Fillmore for the benefit of the entire city, nothing less. Next slide. 125 Mason. An 83-unit housing project at Mason between Ellis and Eddy. Take the time to notice the city around it. The Hilton on one side, Park 55 Hotel on the other, and the still present denizens on the edge of the Tenderloin, 2 blocks from the Powell Street cable car hub and the Bart Powell Street station. So close that as a transit first project in San Francisco, we didn't need to add a level for parking. So we used all of the space for residential with just 13 cars are parked on site. Doesn't this population deserve the best we can design? Can we lift spirits along with providing a place to sleep and take transformative social reintegration classes? We think so. This is a 14-story residential tower that not only offers shelter, but poetry. From its shifted tower on the 9th floor, just to keep from casting a shadow on a park a couple of blocks away, which then created a wonderful outdoor level for the apartments. So architecturally wonderful, but it also has poetry. Remember Mildred Howard, the artist from the Blue Bridge? She is also the artist represented on these walls in tile and stone. Remember how moved you were when you heard Amanda Gorman orating from the Biden inauguration? Go to 125 Mason and read out loud in your own voice, the poetry breaking out from these walls. Grace flows like water, like music, and the miracles appear in the trees. Next slide. We find the way like water, like rain enters earth. Next slide. Grace flows like water, like music. We find the way water, like rain, enters the earth. You can and should read them for yourself out loud. For me, the Hallidie Plaza elevator. Next slide. Oh, go back to the last slide, please. You can see that shift in the structure, which not only gave 125 Mason some coolness from the street, but it had created that upper level plaza for the residents. And it was designed by another WashU alum who was the director of design at MWA at the time, Rod Henme. Fantastic project. Next slide. The Hallidie Plaza elevator. This project grew out of a lawsuit just 2 blocks from 125 Mason on Market and Powell, one of the busiest intersections in San Francisco, right across from Nordstrom's. On Market, the hub for all just to collect maps and get on cable cars once upon a time to go to the bay. But the problem that arose was this. There were escalators to get you from Market Street to the plaza below, which you could see, and an elevator a block away to get you from Market all the way down to the BART concourse, but nothing that would link you from Market to the plaza to the concourse in one place. That's where this project came into being. The solution was an elevator. Not just a mechanical device, but for us, it had to be also an urban marker, an orientation point, like the ferry building at the end of Market on the Embarcadero. The elevator itself was pretty functional. It was a budget elevator, but they allowed us to wrap it in this transparent stainless steel skin to be this wonderful, wonderful urban marker. The perforated metal has just enough density so that you can see all the way through it, so that there are no hiding places, and enough density that it created a nice skin. The elevator still marks the plaza at Market Street and the connection to BART, but it could use more maintenance. Next slide. And yeah, so you can see there it is across from Nordstrom and approaching it from the street from 125 Mason. Next slide. Yes, all of the connections to all the cities in the world, and not all of them, but a lot of the cities in the world, right there at a street sign at Hallidie Plaza where you can get on the cable car. Next. Next slide. And besides, there's absolutely nothing cooler than having Italians write about your work. Nope, go back. One back. Yeah. I got a call one day that said, next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, that the architecture magazine Larca wanted to write an article about our station, Un Totem Technologico, a lift for the plaza. Who could say no? The Yerba Buena Moscone Transit Station, next. A new transit station for a new subway line at 4th and Folsom. It isn't finished yet, but will be soon, with a transformative sculpture at the plaza by Roxy Payne. And so intuitive will this urban marker be, you won't need an address. Just find the spiky 114-foot stainless steel tower and you'll know where the station is. And there will be art by Catherine Wagner at the street level, Roxy Payne at the corner, and more even below. The design was driven by a desire to have light from the street to the lower level and from the glass elevator. So you will always be in the station, in the light, even when you're traveling down from 4th Street down to the concourse. And on the half block still left, you can see to the left of that slide, there will be a new housing block right next to it, designed by that other WashU alum, Rod Henme. Next slide, please. It'll all be there: housing, light, art, transportation. Next slide. We're getting close. I don't know if we'll have any population to ride the subway again, but I'm hopeful. Next slide. Now, the Hallidie Building is the first iconic American curtain-walled high-rise from 1917. The simple fact is that although American commercial dominance is associated with big, city-defining high-rises, the fact of the matter is that the American high-rise began with Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan's red brick and stone Wainwright Building in St. Louis, Missouri in 1890. Next slide, please. And the St. Louisan should recognize that. This is the American high-rise would reach its apotheosis 28 years later with Willis Polk's 1918 Hallidie Building. But the Wainwright Building established the vertical steel structure as the dominant idea of the tall buildings, not just stacking horizontal on horizontal plates, but a soaring structure of steel driving the design. The 1917-18 Hallidie Building prefigured the pursuit of every tall building architect, the curtain wall. Next slide. Here's what Willis Polk imagined. In the year of the 1917 pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, Polk gave us all a functional view of the future. The separation of the vertical structure with a plane of glass floating just outside of it. Imagine that. A plane of glass unencumbered by the structure of the building, but carrying its own skinny load outside of it. It was too stark for the developers at the time, so Polk said, fine, I'll add some sculptural details horizontally to satisfy them. But as you can see, they are also floating, telling the structure, you hold the floors, we will hold the imaginations of everyone who walks by. Next slide. Beautiful. Next slide. So for right now, ladies and gentlemen, architects and citizens, I give you the vision of the future of the American tall building, the 1918 Hallidie Building by the genius, Willis Polk, no relation. On to the future. Next slide. Since this is the last project of the tour, I won't say much. I'm just going to ask you to go there and let your imagination wander. The quintessential urban park and transportation hub atop a lacy steel skin in downtown San Francisco. If you remember, the park had to be closed for months while the agency figured out how to repair the cracks in the structural beams that appeared below. But in a way, that time away from people gave the flora a chance to truly take hold. So when people finally were able to come, it was a fully formed garden with plants from all around the world related to San Francisco's Mediterranean climate and beyond. This is a vision of a kind of urban utopia, places to sit. Next slide. That's the lacy steel skin. And one day at the bottom left, you'll see the cables from the gondola, which you'll be able to ride from the street all the way up to the garden. Next slide. This is a vision of a kind of urban utopia, quiet places to sit, contemplate, and take time away from the daily travails. It's open right now. Go, walk, sit, contemplate over the 4.5 football fields in length. Ordinarily, you would be able to ride the gondola directly from the top to the top from Mission and Fremont, but the escalators and the elevators still function, so up you go. Go from end to end and think about yourself, your life, your day, your connections to family, to friends, and of course, the city. It is one of the truly new undiscovered places in San Francisco. Next slide. Next slide. thank you for coming on the virtual tour and taking the theme from a window that had the message stuck on the wall with posted squares. You look nice today. Shirley and I thank you.
Thank you for the picture, Michael. It's lovely. We look like a team. Anyway, I guess I want to really thank you for your very personal and insightful look at San Francisco today from both a current and a historical perspective. So are you ready to take some questions?
Yes. The
first one I'm going to start with is, how are these projects designed to withstand earthquakes?
The projects are designed to, all the projects are designed to withstand earthquakes. And I just have to tell you that because the information evolves about how earthquakes affect buildings, it's the earthquake design formulas change over time. For instance, after the, what was it, this 91, the Simi Valley earthquake in Southern California, experts went down, studied it, saw what worked, and then started changing the earthquake code up here in Northern California and other places. So in another, just to be plain, the earthquake formulas evolve. Whenever there's an earthquake, the experts go to look at it to see what worked, what didn't work. Do we have to change our formula? Or yes, we are on the right track.
Another question that came up earlier is, what are your thoughts on current trends in San Francisco architecture?
Well, my wish is for the trend to see denser housing near transit stops, and we're using that extra land, which were former freeway turnoffs and parking lots, for housing. Trying to make the streets more engaging rather than something just buildings to pass by in a car. More room for bicycles and walkers. As for the prevailing style of the city, San Francisco to me has always been more about the fabric of the buildings rather than the individual buildings. So if you go to the top of any hilltop and look at the buildings draped over the topography, that's San Francisco to me. Every here and there is a building that does stand out specifically, but for me, really, it's the fabric of the city that's beautiful, that makes it magic from the hills down to the water.
We also had a request, Michael, that you discuss Bayview.
Well, I do have a perspective on Bayview. It's still the largest concentration of the Black population in the city, although new residents are moving in due to housing pressures elsewhere in the city. One of my firm's largest projects, the biosolids infrastructure project at the Southeast Treatment Plant, it's the largest in San Francisco, takes 80% of the San Francisco wastewater just by itself. We held over 90 public meetings to get the views of the people living across the street from the plant and what they could expect as public benefits. I remember there were some, and some of those conversations got pretty tough, just like the ones in the Fillmore. I remember some people saying, "Oh, this is you're moving us out." Well, and some of the data that we were able to find at the time said that the population didn't change from the Black population. There were just more people moving in. So the percentage changed, not necessarily by pushing people out, but by adding more housing on what was the naval base and hillsides, which never had housing, and also increasing the density along the T3 market, the T3 Muni transit line. So the Public Utilities Commission, I have to say, took the tough conversations very seriously in order to answer questions, real questions about people's mistrust of, well, the public agencies and how to make something that works for them as public, as a benefit to them, not just a benefit to the whole city, but directly to them. And yes, there are still some issues about wealth transfer, where people who own their own homes in the Bayview for generations now have to transfer those houses to their children and sometimes children's children. And they have to bear the cost of the maintenance and property taxes, which would have been much higher than when the houses were first built. But there are no easy solutions. I think the aspiration is to make sure for the city that when they approve new housing, they make sure that there's room for the current residents in those housing developments.
A lot of work still to be done there.
Yeah.
If you had one piece of advice for business leaders in the design sustainability, design commercial, or residential development space, looking to be part of the solution to racial economic equality through their work, what would it be and why?
Well, I'm not a developer, but nothing we've ever done has been built without the involvement of the business leaders and those developers, even if those were nonprofit developers like the one behind me, building housing for a purely affordable group. You still need them, but you need them to think about it in a different way. I was going to put on my Pollyanna social work hat, but my wife, who's also a social worker, told me to leave Pollyanna out of it and just talk about the social work aspect. And I would answer it like this: you should see it, business leaders, as being to your financial benefit to do so, to include people, to be sustainable, to be a part of the racial and economic equality. It's to your business interest. What economic reality means to me is that more citizens, not just selected citizens, but more citizens have more money to put into the economy everywhere and in all sectors. So with my architect's hat on, I would say you should never design down. You should, that is, design at your highest level every time. Because if you see a lot of the buildings that we look at, including the Hallidie Building, including former warehouses that are now office buildings that will now be housing, there's an adaptive reuse to housing that says, if you design it in a way that is the best design, then it can be adapted as the future evolves. So think about it this way. Every building that you build has an effect on the city around it. So your work doesn't stay neatly within property lines. Every project is the city, and every city is the sum of its projects.
Michael, you might add to that. I think in the past you've told me that part of the requirements or the recommendations in San Francisco are that when a developer starts a new project, a certain percentage or a certain amount of their expenditure has to go to affordable housing. Is that still a policy in San Francisco?
Yes, that's the so-called inclusionary housing, where when we were just building a few buildings, including this one behind me for Glide Church, 125 Mason, which was also a Glide project, and many, many others, they said to private developers who are building the high rises downtown surrounding, say, Salesforce Park, that we will allow you, for instance, some extra density if you put affordable housing either in your building, on the site, use that percentage, and it's gone from 15 to 30% of affordable units for your project. So you can either take that money and make it possible for some other project to be built, for instance, to help finance buildings like the Glide project behind me, or that money can go to the mayor's office of housing and community development, and they will use that money for affordable housing. So there is, and it's also happening in other cities as well. So there is a way to say, yes, we want you to build in San Francisco, but we also want to make it possible to use some of that financial moving ahead to build for an affordable community.
Okay. Well, Michael, our next question is one I can answer. So that is age 54 too old to get into the architecture industry?
Well,
Definitely not. Of course you can.
definitely not. No, jump in. Jump in. One of the examples that we heard when we were studying architecture is that the great Louis Kahn was over 51 years old before he was recognized as an architect. So we do need experienced observers in this field. So come on in.
Okay.
54, sure.
All right. Another question now from the Q&A. Who is responsible for the care of a treasure like the Blue Bridge in the Fillmore? Or could we ask the same question also about the Hallidie Plaza elevator, which you said needs a little assistance at this point?
Yeah, for the Blue Bridge, it is a little complicated. I talked to the artist Mildred Howard, who is doing work. You can look her up. She's doing work all over. She was just featured in the Chronicle as one of the significant Black artists in the area. She's got work all over the country. Anyway, she's a little upset about it. And the building is not, sorry, the Blue Bridge was not a project from the San Francisco Art Commission, which you would normally expect to putting that, so the so-called percent for art in any public project. But this was a project of San Francisco redevelopment. And I've written my own letters to the various organizations saying, isn't there something we can do about this? And I haven't heard back yet, but as you could see, it hasn't stopped Mildred. She's still making art. We were so pleased to have her be a part of 125 Mason. So yeah, we can't stop. If this had happened to, I mean, how many articles do you read about conservators repairing and cleaning and replacing art all over the world? Why should this be any different? So yeah, the door is wide open. So if anybody out there's got ideas or some donors, let me know.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts or insider knowledge about what's happening with the Millennium Tower debacle?
Yeah, the Millennium Tower is across from, it's in that same block neighborhood as the Salesforce Tower, which is the tallest building in San Francisco. And another thing about designing to earthquake standards in San Francisco, you should know that not all buildings go down to what we even refer to as bedrock. We don't really have bedrock as we have it in Chicago or in other cities, even in some other places in the Bay Area. But there were, in a nutshell, two ways to build in this earthquake environment, high rises in this earthquake environment. One is to drill down through the surface till you started to get some resistance on the piles, and then multiply that by however many piles that would create a stable surface to build the building. That's one way of doing it. So you drill down and grab whatever you could grab in this kind of mushy geological earth landscape. The other way to do it is to design a giant pad several stories deep, so thick, and then put the building on top of that. They're both allowed. This is not unusual. So that big pad is designed so that, yeah, there would be some sinking, but it would be controlled to the point where it would be stable at the height that you're building your building. What Millennium Tower was arguing is that when the buildings were built across the street from it, Salesforce Tower, it destabilized that handshake agreement that that structural pad had with the Millennium Tower. And when they dewatered the site across the street for the Salesforce and for Transbay Terminal, it destabilized the big pad for the Millennium just enough that it started to lean out of alignment, I think about 5 inches at the top, and sink about 17 inches instead of the 8, which is what it was designed for. So many lawyers later, the solution is they've come up with a solution, and it's going to be crazy expensive. But to now drill on the Millennium Tower site down as far as they can drill, I don't know how far, but then to use those new piles to stabilize the pad. And we'll have to, Google the engineers to figure out how they're doing this, but that's the general idea. And the construction cranes are out there now on the Millennium Tower. And the Millennium Tower was one of the inclusionary housing funders for our GLIDE project. So I mean, that's where a lot of the money came from for at least the project behind me.
Do you know if there's been any determination at all about who's going to bear the burden of these costs?
No, I mean, I don't know, because as I say, it's it has to be I think it has to be coming to an agreement, because the engineers did in fact design Millennium Tower to code. It wasn't some, it wasn't some renegade way of making a tall building. It was allowed. So it's not an easy problem to solve, and I'm happy to leave that to other people.
Based on the vision you outlined for the future of San Francisco, can you identify any of the up-and-coming architects who will take the lead in pursuing that?
Well, some of all of the firms that I used to work with when I was still in practice are evolving. New leadership is coming into a lot of these firms. There are some really cool younger firms that are looking at things like modular building, that are looking at things like going on to, I would say, leftover sites and finding creative ways to use those sites. And so we're seeing a new crop of architects not doing what was done years ago, but looking at new ways of bringing housing to new housing and buildings to San Francisco. And so there are young firms like A3 Studios, Anne Fougeron's office with some of the great affordable housing projects, David Baker and Associates. David's got this fresh young crop of people doing new work. It's not just David in there. It's figuring out what the next act should be and how we can be a part of it. And I'll sit down and think of a whole raft of names, but Black architects, young firms are a part of it.
Thank you. I also have a question from someone who's obviously not a San Franciscan. And he's questioning how to reconcile the dichotomy in San Francisco, where to this outsider, absolutely nothing appears to be affordable. Who's going to live here and how do we all afford it?
Yeah, that you're not dreaming. That dichotomy is real. San Francisco is one of the most expensive places to own or rent a place to live. And affordability is a term of art, specific to the place. So it's different in St. Louis or, well, anywhere else, really. San Francisco is on a peak of its own. But the tables are shifting for many industries, including the tech industries. If you're reading the papers today, Salesforce is giving up huge amounts of square footage in in their office leases because people are working from home. And those people who were making enough to live in $4,000 a month studios can live remotely in a house in another state and still work in tech. So the city is trying to use developers to use their incentives to increase the affordability for houses. As I mentioned, the inclusionary housing is one program you can look up in San Francisco's inclusionary housing program. So I think that the city is going to have to adjust itself. In 1955, San Francisco was a working class city with, longshoremen pulling, crates off of ships and into the warehouses along the Embarcadero. That's no longer the case. So the city has not stood still, and I don't think, even with the pandemic, after the pandemic, people will figure out again how to use the city, and they will be back. But in point of fact, in the short term, in the near term, I will say, yes, we're seeing a lot of people moving outside the city in more affordable places because they can. My young nephew just moved to Texas, and he's working, and he was in Portland, and he's working for Intel. And as far as they know, he shows up on the Zoom. The work keeps getting done, and it doesn't really matter that much where he is. So, yeah, I would say that the big shift will be seeing the impact of working from home even post Corona.
Another interesting question, Michael. Do you have any thoughts about what architects can do to combat climate change?
Well, what architects are, just like everyone else, learning how we can use, let's say, the climate change wave to make buildings better. We're looking at ways of using materials that capture carbon. That's new building materials. We're looking at ways of treating the land so that water doesn't just drain off a parking lot into a curb, into a pipe, and into a dam, but how to get that water to trickle back into the earth. one of the best things that we can do, I mentioned adaptive reuse before. One of the best things we can do as architects is reuse the building materials that captured all of that energy to build bricks and blocks and even old concrete into new structures. Like how can we reuse what we already have to build for the current environment? And so the the AIA and others are forever giving seminars and workshops on how architects can be agents of climate change. And that's everything from reusing water, so that we're not just using fresh water for everything. We only need fresh water for about 27% of the cycle: cooking, bathing, and drinking. The rest could be recycled, and we already have some laws in California which will allow the reuse of water for landscaping. So it's a bigger problem than just how cool does the building look, so it's really at all levels. You have to really get deep into it.
Michael, Kristen Robertson noted that Salesforce Park reminds her of the High Line in New York City. And she's curious, what is underneath Salesforce Park? And you might address also, don't we have in San Francisco a relationship with the High Line design team?
Well, what's underneath Salesforce is the Trans-Bay Terminal. Every bus that comes across the bay from Oakland goes to that terminal. It's also designed to be a multi-level transit hub for Caltrain, which is just the California rail line. And one fine day, the high-speed rail, it's all supposed to connect at Trans-Bay Terminal. So if you look underneath it, it's a transit hub, a beautiful transit hub. And Highline was the Highline was the West Side Highway. It was just it was a rail line. I mean, it was a highway that was repurposed into this magnificent park. So in this particular case, the the park on top of Trans-Bay Terminal was designed as a park, but it does have a relationship with the High Line, and its architects, I don't know. But one more thing I wanted to say about housing. If you're looking at how we can think about how we got to where we are with zoning and single family zoning and red line districts, I refer you to the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And it will give you a sense of how the districts which show poorer outcomes in health, income, insurance, transportation, food deserts, are all determined by zip codes which were done on purpose, not by accident. So I would get that book and make sure you have a stiff drink beside you, because some of it's a little tough to take when you just read it in this factual way about how laws were designed to box out this population. And what I would like to see people do is flip the script, make all neighborhoods good neighborhoods, zoned as they should be: single, multiple, mixed income, senior families, everything connected to schools, services, grocery stores, and transportation.
Another interesting question is it too early for planners and architects to begin considering the impact of COVID on city design?
No. I was just speaking to I was speaking to my wife about this, who is a social worker. And I pointed out to her, and also kind of a world traveler, I pointed out to her that when we were in, various cities around the world, you would see in the main plaza a fountain or a sculpture designed to commemorate the pest when Europe was every few years, some wild disease would come through and wipe out half the population, and they rebuilt it so that we can look at it now and sit out in the Oza.
Michael, we had a little disruption there. You weren't very clear. Someone else also.
1917, 1918 Spanish flu. Sorry?
I don't know where that came from. But we did have a similar question from someone else regarding the impact of parklets.
Yes.
Yeah. And how are those going to be affected by the current situations?
I think the parklets are here to stay. It's a new way to use the streets other than just for parking cars. Embrace them.
So I think we've come to the end, and probably we have one more question, but that's mine. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And Michael, as always, it's a treat to work with you. So my last question is, are you planning another one of these for 2023?
2023. That sounds
biennial.
That sounds like the future. We will talk about that. I think this is a great thing that the university does to connect people to the city that they're in. Actually, any city. So, and every time we've had a walk, even if we've walked over the same area, it's changed. Nothing stays the same. So it's a great thing for the university. It's wonderful working with you, as always, Shirley, and thank you all for joining us for this event.
Yes, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but again, thank you for coming.